Welcome back to the deep dive, where today we are undertaking a pretty profound intellectual journey.
Yeah, we really are. It's a massive topic.
It is. We are looking directly at Lecture 214 of the Tolu Islam digital audio series, and specifically focusing on Surah Ta-Ha, verses 9 through 17.
Right, and we are unpacking all of this through the framework of the scholar Ghulam Ahmad Parwez, which is just, I mean, it is a revolutionary reinterpretation of these verses.
It completely shifts the paradigm for you, because the mission today is to essentially dismantle these traditional, really superstitious readings of ancient texts.
Exactly, to strip away the magic and extract a highly logical socio-political framework that actually speaks to human civilization right now.
So to start, I want you to think about how you were probably taught this story when you were a kid. Because usually when we talk about this specific scene with Moses in the desert, there's this underlying expectation of, well, cinematic magic.
Oh, totally. It is straight out of a Hollywood epic.
Right. You picture this dark, sweeping desert night, and there's a magical burning bush that just somehow doesn't turn to ash.
And the spooky, disembodied voices echoing from the sky.
Exactly, echoing from the clouds. And Moses is just this lone figure cowering on the ground in trembling fear.
Yeah, lightning flashes, the earth shakes. We are conditioned to view it as this entirely supernatural spectacle, you know?
Like a magic trick.
Exactly like a magic trick. It is so binary. You have the mundane world of sand and sheep, and then suddenly, boom, a magic trick from the sky interrupts reality.
But when you actually step into the socio-political analysis of this specific text, that entire fairy tale just shatters.
It really does. It completely falls apart.
You realize you aren't looking at a campfire ghost story. You are looking at a deeply pragmatic blueprint for dismantling a corrupt empire.
Because according to Parwez's interpretation, that traditional superstitious reading is really just a superficial placeholder.
A placeholder for what exactly?
For a much deeper, highly logical reality. In this framework, Moses is absolutely not a passive, terrified victim of a supernatural event.
Right. He isn't just stumbling around and getting spooked by a bush.
Not at all. He is a highly observant, intellectually mature leader. I mean, this is a man who has spent years studying the brutal socio-political machinery of Pharaoh's empire from the absolute inside.
And that is a huge distinction.
It is everything. The text emphasizes that Moses is actively searching. He is looking for a spark of guidance. The Arabic term used is huda, to navigate a fundamentally oppressive world.
So when he sees that fire in the desert, it's not a spooky campfire.
No, it is the definitive calling to a systemic revolution.
Which brings us to how his revolutionary mind was actually forged in the first place. Because, you don't just pick someone at random to topple the most powerful empire on Earth.
Right, you need a very specific kind of person.
And the lecture dives deep into Moses' background to explain the strategic necessity of his dual education, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, the dual education is key.
Let's unpack that first phase, because it happens right in the belly of the beast. He grows up in Pharaoh's palace, and I have always kind of struggled to reconcile this, honestly.
How so?
Well, if he is meant to be the liberator of the oppressed, wouldn't growing up in the lap of luxury at the palace just completely blind him to their suffering?
You would think so, yeah.
Like, how does this analytical framework justify that as a positive thing?
It is a really good question, because luxury usually breeds complacency. But in Parwez's analysis, Moses wasn't just passively eating grapes in the palace. He was basically receiving a master class in the architecture of oppression.
Oh, wow. So he was studying them.
Exactly. By growing up in the inner circle, he was learning the deep-seated conspiracies, the political maneuverings, and just the sheer calculated tyranny of the ruling elite.
He knew how the oppressor's mind worked.
Because he sat at their dinner table, he listened to their strategy. Oppression at a state level isn't just random cruelty.
Right, it takes work.
It takes infrastructure. It requires a massive system designed to keep the elite in power and the masses, the Israelites in this case, subjugated.
He's seeing how the sausage is made.
Yeah, he saw how that infrastructure was funded, how it was defended, and crucially, where its structural weaknesses were.
Which is operational intelligence you just cannot get from the outside looking in.
You have to be embedded in it. But knowing how the oppressor operates is really only half the equation.
Right, because you also have to understand the people you're trying to liberate.
Which leads perfectly into the second phase of his education, as his time in exile as a shepherd.
And the lecture spends an incredible amount of time on the linguistic connection here. It explores the Arabic words rai and raya.
Yes, the linguistic root is so important here. Rai translates to shepherd,
Okay.
and rayi translates to the flock. Or, if we are looking at it in a broader socio-political context, the public, the citizenry.
And the contrast here is just stark, because Pharaoh viewed the raya, the citizens, as just a resource to be consumed.
Basically, yeah, Pharaoh was a butcher, not a shepherd.
A butcher. That is a great way to put it.
In a corrupt system, the elite feed on the flock. But a true rai, a true shepherd, operates on the exact opposite principle.
Their primary function is protection.
Exactly. They protect the flock from harm. They guide it to pasture. They ensure its survival and flourishing, often at their own expense.
They stand between the sheep and the wolves.
So in this interpretation, Moses' time in the desert is essentially this intensive recalibration of his worldview.
From the palace to the pasture.
Right. He learns the corrupt, consumptive governance of the palace, and then he is forced to learn the pure, protective governance of the pasture.
That is so profound, and it brings us right up to that fateful night in the desert.
The fire.
Right. Moses is traveling with his family. It is a cold, dark night, and he sees a fire in the distance. And the traditional reading just sort of says, well, God put a fire there to get his attention.
Just waving a flag, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But the analysis we are exploring today digs into his internal monologue in this moment. He tells his family to stay behind while he investigates. Why?
Because he is applying pure logic.
The lecture calls it an act of human deduction, or qiyas, trial and error.
Yes, his mind works sequentially. He sees the fire and thinks, well, where there is a fire, there must be a person.
Right.
And if there is a person, that person might know the way. They might provide guidance.
He is physically lost in a cold desert, and he is just using deductive reasoning to find a solution.
And the lecture uses this very specific physical moment as a massive metaphor for humanity's overarching struggle.
It's a struggle of the intellect.
Exactly. Throughout history, the human intellect is essentially wandering in the dark, relying entirely on this process of trial and error.
Think about how human civilization has evolved politically.
It is brutal. We stumble around in the dark for thousands of years.
We build societies based on absolute monarchies, and then they collapse in bloodshed.
We try feudalism, it leads to mass starvation, we oppress each other, we fight these endless wars, we make so many mistakes, all just to slowly, painfully figure out the basic mathematical realities of what makes a society stable.
It is an exhausting, bloody process of deduction.
It really is.
It makes me think of a rat in a maze, just bumping into walls for centuries, suffering and bleeding, just trying to find the cheese.
Right, and in this context, the cheese is a just, equitable society.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more, because this is where the framework introduces this incredibly fascinating concept from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead and the poet Allama Iqbal.
The true function of revelation.
Yes, Wahi. The central thesis they present is that revelation economizes human effort.
Economizes human effort. It is such a brilliant phrase.
So let me make sure I am grasping the mechanics of this. If humanity is the rat in the maze, and trial and error is us just bumping into walls for 5,000 years to realize that tyranny doesn't work, is revelation essentially just the maze designer handing over the blueprint?
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. According to this framework, wahi, or revelation, provides a shortcut to objective truth.
A shortcut?
Right. If humanity relies solely on its own intellectual trial and error, it takes millennia of systemic failure to realize that certain socioeconomic structures destroy a society from the inside out.
We have to keep bleeding to learn.
Exactly. So revelation steps in to wrap up those long, painful distances. It delivers the objective truth immediately, so humanity doesn't have to keep suffering across hundreds of generations to learn fundamental social realities.
It's like, you don't need to put your hand on the hot stove 50 times to figure out the physics of a burn.
Right. The blueprint just says, hey, this stove will burn you. Build the kitchen differently.
It saves an immeasurable amount of time and suffering.
It really does. And the analysis emphasizes that this kind of objective knowledge, this wahi, is not something a person can achieve just by sitting in a cave and thinking harder.
You can't just deduce your way to the perfect system.
No, it is direct knowledge bestowed upon a mind that has been rigorously prepared to receive it. Moses' mind, forged by the palace and tempered by the pasture, was ready.
He had exhausted the limits of his own intellect.
He knew exactly what the problem was with Pharaoh's system, but human intellect alone couldn't provide the ultimate flawless solution to replace it.
Okay, so if Moses has reached the limit of human deduction, what is the very first step of receiving this new blueprint?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Because the first command he receives isn't some grand thesis on statecraft. We look at Ayat 12 of Surah Ta-Ha. Take off your sandals, you are in the sacred valley of Tuwa.
And this is where we see the most aggressive departure from traditional interpretations.
Yeah, because a surface-level reading just suggests that God is demanding respect for a patch of dirt.
Right, like, it is a holy zone, so take off your dusty shoes.
Which honestly feels a little absurd when you think about the stakes here. I mean, we are talking about the liberation of an entire population and the toppling of a superpower, and the opening move is an argument over footwear.
It reduces the divine command to a matter of mere etiquette. And the scholar in our text completely rejects this.
Because it doesn't align with the gravity of the socio-political framework at all.
Not even a little. In this interpretation, removing your sandals is a profound systemic metaphor.
Okay, a metaphor for what?
It is about stripping away old attachments, inherent biases, and most importantly, any lingering dependencies on an exploitative system.
So let's look at how that actually works in practice. What does it actually mean to wear the sandals of a corrupt system?
Well, think of it as a core rule of social change. You cannot dismantle a corrupt establishment while you are still wearing its socioeconomic infrastructure on your feet.
Oh, wow.
You cannot be dependent on the very system you are trying to overthrow. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace. Even though he fled, he was likely carrying massive psychological baggage.
Assumptions about how power operates.
Exactly.
You can't walk into a revolution wearing the oppressor's shoes. You can't rely on Pharaoh's economy or Pharaoh's definitions of success or his methods of control.
You have to divest completely.
But what does that mean for the listener today? What are the sandals in our modern world?
In modern terms, sandals could be anything that tethers you to a broken status quo.
Like financial dependencies.
Yeah, the comfort of a steady paycheck from a corrupt institution, or even just a worldview shaped by the media of the ruling elite.
So before you can absorb a truly equitable system of laws, you have to completely divest yourself of the comforts that the broken system provides you.
You have to clear your internal landscape.
That makes so much sense. And that brings us to the dissection of the word Tuwa itself, because the text doesn't treat this as just a geographical spot on a map.
No, linguistically, the Arabic root of tuwa means to roll up or to fold.
To fold, okay.
And this is where the metaphor becomes really breathtaking if we connect it back to the idea of economizing human effort. Like rolling up a massive carpet, the long, exhausting distances of Moses's physical and intellectual wanderings are suddenly folded away.
His period of searching is over.
Yes. His trial and error in the cold, dark desert is finished. The era of direct, systemic action has begun.
So he is intellectually stripped down. He has shed his past, the distances are rolled up, and he is entirely present.
He is a pure vessel for a new ideology.
Which flips the script to the actual nature of his assignment, bringing us to Ayat 13 and 14. And I have chosen you, so listen to what is revealed.
The phrasing "I have chosen you" is heavily scrutinized in this lecture.
It emphatically argues that this wasn't a random lottery, right?
God didn't just pick a name out of a hat because Moses happened to be wandering past the right bush at the right time.
It was based on merit. It was rooted entirely in Moses' rigorous intellectual readiness and his deep empathy for the oppressed.
He had the sharp intellect required to deconstruct a systemic empire, and the heart of a Rai to care about its victims.
And notice the nature of the revelation he is given. In this framework, the Wahi is not some emotional sedative.
It is not a spiritual mantra meant to help him achieve inner peace while the world burns around him.
Right.
It is a heavy, direct command to apply pure reason and objective truth against the tyranny of unproven assertions.
Now, that is a phrase we need to dig into. What exactly do we mean by unproven assertions?
Well, a corrupt society operates on foundational lies that everyone just accepts as reality.
Give me an example.
Like the assertion that Pharaoh is a literal god, or the assertion that the Israelites are biologically destined to be slaves.
Right. They are totally unproven, but they hold the entire empire together.
Exactly. They are the glue of tyranny.
And to counter those assertions, the lecture brings up Whitehead's concept of idolatry again. And honestly, this completely rewired my brain.
It is a brilliant redefinition.
Because we usually think of idolatry as bowing to a stone statue or worshiping a golden calf.
Right. A very literal physical act.
But Whitehead and Parwez, in his analysis, define it much more broadly. They argue that idolatry is the act of sitting down, perfectly satisfied and comfortable with a corrupt, broken status quo.
In this view, complacency is the ultimate form of false worship.
Complacency is false worship. That is heavy.
Accepting a tyrannical reality as immutable is idolatrous. A true revolutionary in this framework is fundamentally restless.
Their intellect refuses to accept the unproven assertions of the ruling class.
They literally cannot find peace while oppression exists.
So, to combat that idolatry of the status quo, Moses is given a very specific command. Ayat 14 says, "Establish Salah for my zikr."
And traditionally, this is translated simply as establish prayer for my remembrance.
Right, just perform a ritual. But
Yeah.
this framework explicitly redefines this.
Parwez argues this is absolutely not a command to just sit in a corner, count beads, and chant while society collapses.
That would defeat the whole purpose.
Exactly. In this socio-political context, Salah represents the establishment of a concrete, socioeconomic system of divine laws.
It is the architectural blueprint for a just society.
Yes.
And zikr, what does that translate to here?
Zikr translates to remembrance or keeping something present. So, establishing Salat for my zikr means building an equitable societal system that keeps objective truths and fundamental human rights constantly active and present in the daily operations of the state.
So it is an active, ongoing, systemic process.
Completely.
And this system Moses is tasked to build is designed as a direct countermeasure to the existing establishment in Egypt. The lecture highlights 3 specific pillars of exploitation that Pharaoh's empire was built on.
The triad of tyranny.
Yes, the triad. This is where the socio-political analysis really shines, I think. Let's break these down, starting with the first pillar.
The first pillar is political dictatorship, represented by Pharaoh himself.
Okay.
This is the centralization of absolute power. Pharaoh controls the state apparatus, the military, the laws. He possesses total physical control over the bodies of the citizens.
But physical control isn't enough to sustain an empire long-term, which brings us to the second pillar.
Religious or clerical manipulation.
Represented by a historical figure named Haman.
Right. If Pharaoh controls the bodies, Haman controls the minds.
Now, I want to linger on Haman's role for a second because it is so incredibly insidious.
It is the most dangerous pillar, arguably.
Haman represents the psychological infrastructure of oppression. He uses superstition, the fear of the unseen, and a manufactured theology to keep the masses subservient.
His job is essentially to convince the oppressed that their oppression is a divine mandate.
Which is terrifying. He tells the Israelites, "You are suffering because the gods will it, and to rebel against Pharaoh is to rebel against the heavens."
It is the ultimate psychological weapon.
You don't even need to point a sword at the masses if you can convince them that their chains are holy.
Exactly. Haman provides the theological justification for Pharaoh's brutality.
And then we have the third pillar.
Capitalist hoarding, represented by Qarun.
This is the economic exploitation side of things.
Yeah.
Qarun represents the monopolization of resources.
The hoarding of wealth by the extreme elite, ensuring that the masses are kept in a perpetual state of desperation.
When you combine these 3, you have a mathematically perfect engine of tyranny.
It is airtight. Political oppression enforces the rules.
Psychological manipulation ensures the masses don't question the rules.
And economic starvation ensures they don't have the resources or energy to fight back even if they wanted to. They're too busy trying to survive the day.
So according to Parwez's framework, Moses is acting as a systemic auditor.
I love that term.
He is walking into an empire built on these 3 unproven assertions. That Pharaoh has political sovereignty over humans, that Haman speaks for the heavens, and that Qarun deserves a monopoly on wealth.
And Moses is bringing the objective data, the Wahi, to shatter that illusion.
He is bringing the ultimate reality check.
He is stepping into the palace to essentially say, your entire system is a mathematical error. It violates the fundamental laws of human existence, and therefore it is fundamentally unstable.
But that raises a massive question for me, and let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure.
How does a system built on such entrenched, multi-layered tyranny actually fall? Because, I mean, you can't just walk into the throne room, drop a philosophical truth bomb, and expect Pharaoh to hand over the keys to the kingdom.
Right, that would be incredibly naive.
What is the actual mechanism of collapse? The lecture argues that the fall of such a system is bound by immutable laws of the universe. And this brings us to the concept of social physics in Ayat 15.
Yes, Ayat 15 introduces the concept of al-Sa'a, commonly translated as the hour.
Again, let's look at the traditional view. When people hear the hour in these ancient texts, they almost always default to a magical, catastrophic, end-of-the-world scenario.
The sky falls, the oceans boil, fire and brimstone.
A literal physical apocalypse.
But the revolutionary translation steps in here and completely alters the landscape.
How so?
In Parwez's analysis, the hour is not a magical explosion. It is the law of social physics in motion.
Social physics.
It is the inevitable moment of revelation when a corrupt society's debt finally comes due.
It implies that human societies operate under laws just as strict and predictable as gravity or thermodynamics.
They do, according to this framework. The text explains that a system built on Hawa, which translates to the capricious, selfish desires of the elite, is mathematically unsustainable.
Because it is based on whims, not laws.
Exactly. When a society is governed by the arbitrary whims of a few rather than objective, equitable laws, it naturally and inevitably degrades.
What is the exact mechanism of that degradation, though? Like, how does it actually rot from the inside?
The Arabic term used for this inevitable ruin is fatarda. Think of it as a structural collapse.
Okay, structural collapse.
Right. So when the elite hoard all the resources, Karun's pillar, they starve the foundational labor class.
Right.
But the elite depend entirely on that labor class to maintain their luxury. So by exploiting the foundation to enrich the penthouse, they are literally hollowing out the very pillars holding up their own floor.
Oh, I see.
Eventually, the foundation crumbles, and the whole structure implodes. It is a scientific certainty.
If you build a tower with a rotten foundation, gravity will eventually bring it down. It is not a matter of if, but when.
Exactly.
What I find fascinating is how the text describes this hour. It says it is kept hidden. The collapse is brewing, but it is invisible to the people in power.
Because oppressors only look at surface-level stability. They equate silence with compliance.
It is like looking at a clock. If you just stare at the minute hand, you can't actually see it moving. It looks totally static.
Right, you might even think the clock is broken.
But underneath the faceplate, the gears are turning relentlessly, the tension is building in the spring, and eventually the clock strikes 12. The alarm goes off.
The pharaohs of the world never see the revolution coming because it builds up invisibly in the quiet desperation of the marginalized.
They think their military and their wealth make them invincible.
But that hidden tension connects directly to what this source calls the law of requital.
The law of requital.
It is the grand ledger of social physics. The principle is simple. Every soul, every society gets exactly what it strives for. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction in the social sphere.
So in the pharaonic system, the elite reap the rewards of the laborers. That creates a massive imbalance in the ledger.
A debt that has to be paid.
The hour is the systemic reset, where that exploitation mathematically corrects itself. It is the moment the false infrastructure collapses under its own weight, and true equity must be established from the rubble.
Right.
But wait, if social physics means corrupt societies collapse naturally on their own, why is Moses even needed?
That is a great point.
Why not just sit back, wait for the clock to strike 12, and let gravity do its job? Why risk your life walking into Pharaoh's court?
That is the crucial pivot of the entire philosophy right there.
Okay, explain that.
Yes, the system will collapse naturally because of fatarda. But a natural collapse is chaotic, bloody, and often just replaces one tyrant with another.
Oh, that makes sense. You just get a new pharaoh.
Exactly. Moses is needed because he possesses the wahi, the objective blueprint. His job isn't just to trigger the collapse. His job is to ensure that when the rubble settles, the society is rebuilt on equitable divine laws.
The Salah.
The Salat.
Yeah.
Rather than just falling back into a new cycle of trial and error and bloodshed, he guides the energy of the collapse toward justice instead of anarchy.
That completely rewrites how we view divine intervention. God isn't sending a literal lightning bolt from the clouds to destroy Pharaoh.
No.
The divine law is already programmed into the fabric of reality. Oppression inherently destroys itself. Moses is being given the awareness of this law and the mission to walk in, accelerate the inevitable, and manage the fallout.
He's not a magician. He is an agent of systemic reality.
He is standing in that dark desert, the distances folded up, his old dependencies stripped away.
He has been firmly anchored to the permanent values required to upend an empire.
He understands both why the system must fall and the exact mechanics of how it will fall. It makes you wonder, if the hour is a social inevitability, what does the clock look like in our own modern societies today?
It is a profound question to sit with.
Are we currently staring at a static minute hand, ignoring the tension building in the gears below the surface? What dependencies, what modern sandals do you need to shed to see your own world with that kind of objective clarity?
It is definitely something you have to figure out for yourself, but understanding the ideology is only the first step.
Right.
An ideology is useless without tools to execute it. In the very next verse, the focus shifts sharply to what Moses is holding in his hand. In Lecture 314, as we cover Ayat 1735, we're going to explore the transformation of a simple shepherd's staff into a systemic tool of revolution, and the psychological shift needed to face Pharaoh himself. Stay tuned.
As we've seen today, we aren't looking at a magical fairy tale of a man shivering in front of a campfire. We are looking at the intense, pragmatic blueprint of how an awakened human mind prepares to tear down an empire. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.